The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet neighborhood as Aaliyah Taylor, a 12-year-old girl, sat on a weathered bench outside a small convenience store, tapping on her phone. She was waiting for her mother, Captain Sarah Taylor, to pick her up after a busy day at school. Aaliyah wore her usual attire, jeans and a hoodie, a normal sight for any teenager, yet on this day, she would find herself in the center of an extraordinary, life-changing event. In a town known for its quiet charm, the past few days had been anything but peaceful. A series of burglaries had plagued the area, with the police stretched thin trying to track down the elusive culprits. The crimes had created a tense atmosphere, especially in the more working-class neighborhoods, where local residents were both worried and frustrated. Patrols were increased, and officers were encouraged to be vigilant, which created an undercurrent of fear among some of the city's less fortunate. Officer Rick Harper was one of the more seasoned patrolmen in the district, and he took his duty to heart perhaps a little too much. Harper had been on the force for over 15 years, and though he'd once been a promising officer, his career had stagnated due to his harsh methods and a tendency to profile individuals based on their appearance. Over the years, his empathy had eroded, replaced by a cynical view of the world. He saw potential criminals in everyone, especially in the more impoverished areas of the city. Harper was known to bend the rules to get results, believing that his gut was his greatest asset. On this day, Harper was driving his patrol car through one of the neighborhoods where the burglaries had been reported. The call had come in earlier, another break-in nearby, and although no one had been caught yet, the police were on high alert. Harper, ever eager to prove himself, was scanning the streets, his eyes darting from house to house, alley to alley, searching for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. As he drove slowly down the street, Harper's attention was drawn to a figure sitting on a bench outside the convenience store. Aaliyah, lost in her phone, seemed to be minding her own business, but to Harper, her presence raised an immediate red flag. In his mind, she fit the description of someone who might be involved in the recent crimes, young, black, and alone in a neighborhood that had been the epicenter of recent trouble. Harper's experiences had conditioned him to make snap judgments, and as far as he was concerned, this was another suspicious figure that needed to be checked out. Pulling over to the curb, Harper watched her for a moment, his suspicions growing by the second. "What's a kid like that doing sitting there all by herself?" he muttered under his breath. Something didn't feel right to him, and he was never one to ignore his instincts. Grabbing his radio, he called in his position, though he made no mention of why he was stopping. "Officer Harper, 1071. I'm on site. Just checking out a possible suspicious person at the corner of Millwood and Grove. Will advise." No one questioned Harper's judgment, and no one thought to ask why he was investigating a girl sitting alone. It was routine, or so they thought. Stepping out of his car, Harper adjusted his belt and walked toward Aaliyah, his boots heavy on the pavement. The sound of his approach startled Aaliyah, who looked up from her phone, eyes wide with surprise. She wasn't used to dealing with the police, especially not in a situation like this. She had been waiting for her mum, completely unaware of the string of burglaries that had recently occurred in the area. "Hey," Harper called out gruffly as he neared the bench. "What are you doing here?" Aaliyah blinked, clearly taken aback by the aggressive tone. "I'm just waiting for my mum," she replied quietly, holding up her phone, as if that might explain everything. Harper eyed her skeptically. He wasn't convinced. "This your neighborhood?" Aaliyah hesitated for a second. It wasn't, but her mother worked nearby. "No, but my mum's picking me up. She's just running late." Harper's eyes narrowed. In his mind, every word she said made her seem more suspicious. "Running late, huh? "What's in the bag?" He nodded toward the small backpack lying at her feet. Aaliyah glanced down at her bag, confused by the sudden shift in the conversation. "Just school stuff." Harper wasn't satisfied. He had been in situations like this before, and more often than not, the innocent explanations turned out to be false. He leaned in slightly, his hand casually resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "You mind if I take a look?" Aaliyah's heart began to race. She wasn't sure why he was asking to look in her bag, but the way he was standing over her, the way his tone had shifted, made her uneasy. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong." Harper's expression hardened. He had dealt with enough suspects in his career to know when someone was hiding something, and to him, this girl was definitely hiding something. His gut told him so. "I didn't ask if you did anything wrong," he replied coldly. "I asked if I could look in the bag." Aaliyah swallowed hard. She wanted to refuse, but the intensity in his voice scared her. She thought of her mother, a police captain, and how she would tell her to stay calm and comply. But something inside Aaliyah rebelled against the unfairness of the situation. She was just sitting here, minding her own business, and now this cop was treating her like a criminal. "I don't think you can do that," she said, her voice wavering but firm. "I didn't do anything." Harper's patience was wearing thin. He straightened up, his jaw clenched. "Look, kid, I'm just doing my job. If you've got nothing to hide, there's no reason to make this difficult. Now, let's not turn this into something it doesn't need to be." Aaliyah shook her head, clutching her bag tighter. "I don't think you can just go through my stuff." That was it. Harper's tolerance had reached its limit. To him, this was more than enough resistance to justify further action. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward Aaliyah's bag. "I'm not going to ask again." "Hand it over," Harper growled, now fully in control of the situation in his mind. He was the authority, and she was the suspect. Aaliyah was frozen, her mind racing. She thought about calling her mum, but before she could act, Harper had already yanked the bag from her grasp, pulling it open and dumping its contents onto the ground. Papers, books, and a pencil case scattered across the pavement. Nothing suspicious. Nothing at all. Harper stood over the mess, his face hard, but inside he felt the slightest flicker of doubt. Maybe he'd overstepped. Maybe this really was just a kid waiting for her mum. But it was too late for second guesses. He'd made his move and now he had to follow through. "Get up," he ordered. What Aaliyah gasped, looking at the scattered contents of her bag. "I told you, I didn't do anything." "You're coming with me," Harper said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest. "My mum is Captain Sarah Taylor. You can't just—" "Yeah, sure she is," Harper interrupted, rolling his eyes as he pulled her to her feet. "Let's go. We'll figure it out at the station." As Officer Rick Harper locked the handcuffs around Aaliyah Taylor's small wrists, her protests were drowned out by the roaring storm of thoughts in his head. He had crossed a line, and deep down, he knew it. Yet, his pride and years of unchecked authority pushed him to continue down the path he had chosen. Harper had built a career on following his gut, and today it was telling him that he had a criminal on his hands, or at least someone who knew something about the recent string of burglaries in the area. Aaliyah, her voice shaky but firm, tried one last time to explain. "I told you, my mum's Captain Sarah Taylor. She'll be here any minute. You can't do this." Harper's irritation flared at the mention of Sarah Taylor's name. He knew Captain Taylor, everyone in the department did. She was tough, no nonsense, and had earned the respect of her colleagues. However, in Harper's mind, she was another one of those officers who talked about justice and equality, but never truly understood what it took to be out on the streets, dealing with real crime. He had little patience for what he considered to be her idealistic approach to policing. To him, the law wasn't about fairness, it was about control, and in this moment he had the upper hand. Yeah, I've heard it all before, Harper grumbled as he roughly guided Aaliyah toward his squad car. Captain's daughter, sure. We'll see what the truth is once we get to the station. Aaliyah felt a sharp sting of panic rise in her chest as Harper opened the back door of the police car and motioned for her to get in. Her mind raced. How could this be happening? One moment she was sitting peacefully, waiting for her mother, and now she was being treated like a criminal. The reality of the situation began to sink in. She thought about her mum, how proud she had always been of Sarah's work in law enforcement. But now Aaliyah was the one on the wrong side of the law, and no one around seemed willing to listen. Harper pushed her inside, slamming the door behind her as if sealing her fate. As he returned to the driver's seat, he couldn't shake a creeping sense of unease. Something about the whole situation wasn't sitting right with him, but he couldn't afford to back down now. Not after he had already made his move. His radio crackled to life as he put the key in the ignition, and he reached for the mic. "Officer Harper, bringing in a suspect for questioning," he said gruffly. "Female juvenile, suspicious behavior. Heading to station now." The dispatcher acknowledged the call, and Harper started the car, pulling away from the curb. As they drove through the neighborhood, the city lights beginning to flicker on as the sun set, Aaliyah sat quietly in the back seat, her mind spinning. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream for help, to somehow make this nightmare end, but she felt trapped, powerless. She thought about texting her mum, but her hands were still bound in cuffs. The thought of Captain Taylor arriving at the station, furious and confused, played over in her head. But more than anything, she feared what might happen before her mum even got there. Meanwhile, in the front seat, Harper's mind was wrestling with his own thoughts. He had gone too far, and now the only option was to justify his actions by pushing forward. If the girl's mother really was Captain Taylor, this situation could spiral out of control fast. But pride and a warped sense of duty kept him on his course. Suddenly, his radio buzzed again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't the dispatcher, it was Captain Sarah Taylor herself. "Harper, this is Captain Taylor." What the hell is going on? Her voice was sharp and authoritative, the kind that commanded attention instantly. Harper's stomach dropped. He knew this was coming, but hearing her voice made it all the more real. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. "Ma'am, I've detained a juvenile suspect matching the description of someone we've been looking for. Suspicious behavior, refusal to comply." There was a long, tense pause on the other end of the line. "And what makes you think that's a valid arrest, Officer Harper? Did you even verify who this girl is before putting her in cuffs?" Taylor's tone was laced with anger, and rightfully so. Harper clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I was following procedure, Captain. She wouldn't cooperate, so I made the call. We'll sort it out at the station." "You didn't make a call, Harper. You made a mistake," Sarah replied, her voice icy and deliberate. "That girl in the back seat? That's my daughter." The air in the car seemed to freeze. For a moment, Harper's heart stopped. Her daughter? His mind raced to process the information, but his mouth spoke before his brain could catch up. "What? Your daughter? Captain, I didn't know." "I'm on my way to the station," Sarah cut him off, her voice more composed but no less fierce. "Do not do anything further. And Harper, you better have a damn good explanation when I get there." The radio clicked off, leaving Harper sitting in stunned silence. His heart was pounding in his chest. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, where he could see Aaliyah's reflection. The girl he had just handcuffed and shoved into the back of his car wasn't just any kid, she was the daughter of one of the most respected captains in the force. A wave of nausea washed over him as the full gravity of the situation hit him. This wasn't just another arrest. This was a colossal mistake, one that could ruin his career, or worse. Harper's thoughts spiraled as the city streets blurred past the windows. What had he done? How could he fix this? There was no way out now, no easy way to backtrack on what he'd done. In the back seat, Aaliyah watched as the familiar streets passed by, her fear mixing with a growing sense of anger. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was furious at the way Harper had treated her, furious at the injustice of it all. And now, knowing that her mum was on her way, Aaliyah's fear was slowly being replaced by a determination to see this through. She had heard enough stories from her mum about police misconduct, but now she was living it. The thought both terrified and emboldened her. As they pulled up to the station, Harper's hands were shaking. He parked the car and sat still for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He glanced again at Aaliyah in the back seat, her face set in a hard, cold stare. She wasn't scared anymore. She knew her mother would be there soon. Harper stepped out of the car, walking around to the back and opening the door. He hesitated for a second before speaking. "Get out," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. Aaliyah stepped out of the car, her hands still bound by the cold metal of the cuffs. She looked Harper dead in the eyes, as if daring him to say anything else. He remained silent, leading her toward the station's entrance. Every step felt heavier than the last. Harper could almost feel the weight of his career slipping through his fingers with each passing second. As they entered the station, the officers inside barely looked up. Harper walked Aaliyah to a small holding area, his mind racing, trying to think of how he could salvage the situation before Captain Taylor arrived. But deep down, he knew there was no easy way out of this. Minutes later, the door to the station burst open, and there stood Captain Sarah Taylor, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Her eyes locked onto Harper immediately, and for the first time in his career, he felt a true and utter sense of dread. This wasn't going to end well. The heavy silence that filled the police station when Captain Sarah Taylor walked in was deafening. Every officer present felt the tension radiating off of her, but no one dared to say a word. All eyes turned to Officer Rick Harper and the young girl he had in cuffs, Aaliyah Taylor, though no one yet fully grasped the severity of the situation. Sarah's reputation preceded her. She was known for her impeccable leadership, unyielding sense of justice, and her ability to hold her officers accountable. Now, standing just feet away from Harper, her usually composed expression was replaced by one of restrained fury. The moment Sarah's eyes locked onto Harper, she could read everything she needed to know in his face. The man stood rigid, pale and sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. But what was worse, he had made that mistake with her daughter. Without breaking eye contact, Sarah spoke in a voice that was calm yet full of underlying menace. "Unlock her handcuffs." Harper, still standing beside Aaliyah, fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to fit the key into the cuffs. Every second seemed to stretch into an eternity. He could feel the eyes of the entire station on him, but none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered now was what Captain Taylor was going to do next. Aaliyah stood still, watching her mother with a mixture of relief and anger. The handcuffs clicked open, and she rubbed her wrists where the cold metal had bitten into her skin. She wanted to run to her mother, to tell her everything that had happened, but Sarah's icy focus was still on Harper, and Aaliyah knew this wasn't over. Harper took a step back, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Captain," he started, his voice hoarse. I didn't know she was your daughter." Sarah's gaze hardened. "You didn't know she was my daughter," she repeated slowly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "And that somehow justifies what you did to her." "No," Harper stammered, trying to find the words. He was cornered now and the walls were closing in. "It's just," she fit the description. "There was suspicious behavior, I thought." "You thought what?" Sarah interrupted, stepping closer to him, her presence overwhelming. "You thought that a 12-year-old girl sitting by herself was somehow involved in the string of burglaries in this neighborhood? You thought that was suspicious behavior?" Harper swallowed hard, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. "I was just following protocol," he said weakly, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. "Following protocol," Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Is this what you call protocol, Officer Harper? Harassing a child, handcuffing her, treating her like a criminal without even bothering to confirm who she was?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the other officers watched the confrontation unfold. Harper shifted uncomfortably under the heat of Sarah's gaze, his mind racing for a way out of this mess, but there was none. He was caught, and he knew it. "I made a mistake," Harper finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "A mistake," Sarah said coldly. "Is that what you call this?" Harper glanced around, as if hoping someone would come to his defense, but there was no help for him here. Every officer present knew that when Sarah Taylor had her sights set on someone, there was no escaping her wrath. He was on his own. "Captain," Harper started again, but Sarah cut him off. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Harper, she demanded, her voice rising slightly, though it was still controlled. "You didn't just make a mistake. You violated my daughter's rights. You profiled her based on nothing but her appearance. You treated her like a criminal, without a shred of evidence. And for what? Because she was sitting quietly, minding her own business." Harper was silent, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no defense, no justification that could possibly explain what he had done. Sarah's eyes flicked toward Aaliyah, who was standing quietly beside her, watching the scene unfold. The anger in her mother's voice was evident, but Aaliyah could also see the concern, the fear that any parent would have when their child was in danger. Sarah turned back to Harper, her voice softening for a moment. "Do you have children?" Harper, she asked quietly. Harper blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes," he muttered, unsure where this was going. "I have 2 boys." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes locked on his. "Then you should understand the rage I'm feeling right now. If someone had treated one of your sons the way you treated my daughter," her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Harper felt a wave of guilt wash over him, but it was too late for remorse. The damage had been done, and there was no turning back. Sarah straightened up, her voice regaining its sharp edge. "There will be an internal investigation into your conduct, Harper, and I promise you, if there is any indication of wrongdoing, any indication that this was anything other than a gross abuse of power, you will be held accountable." The color drained from Harper's face. He had been in the force long enough to know what those words meant. His career, already teetering on the edge, was about to come crashing down. "Captain Taylor," a voice called out from behind. It was Sergeant Mitchell, one of the senior officers in the station. He had been watching the exchange with increasing concern, but now he stepped forward, trying to mediate the situation. "Captain, maybe we can handle this internally," Mitchell suggested cautiously. "Harper made a mistake, but..." Sarah turned sharply to Mitchell, her eyes blazing. This isn't just about a mistake, Sergeant. This is about a pattern of behavior. This is about an officer who thinks he can act with impunity, who thinks he can get away with profiling and mistreating people because no one will call him out on it. Well, I'm calling him out. Mitchell stepped back, realizing that there was no reasoning with Sarah in this moment. She was right, of course. Harper had gone too far, and there was no sweeping this under the rug. I want a full report on this incident, Sarah continued, addressing the entire room now. I want every detail documented. And Harper, you're suspended until further notice. Turn in your badge and your gun. Harper froze, his mind reeling. Suspension? It was worse than he'd feared. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. He had lost. The authority he had clung to for so long was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. With trembling hands, Harper unhooked his badge from his uniform and handed it to Sarah. Then, slowly, he removed his gun from its holster and placed it on the desk in front of him. The room was deathly quiet, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Sarah took the badge and gun without a word, her eyes never leaving Harper's. "You're dismissed, Harper," she said coldly. Harper stood there for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the station, the heavy door closing behind him with a thud. The tension in the room didn't dissipate with Harper's departure. In fact, it only seemed to grow. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that this was far from over. Sarah let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly now that the confrontation was over. She turned to Aliyah, her expression softening for the first time since she had arrived at the station. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with concern. Aliyah nodded, though her face was still tight with emotion. "I'm fine, Mum," she replied, though the events of the day had clearly shaken her. Sarah reached out and pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she whispered, "but I promise you, this isn't over. What Harper did, it's not going to be swept under the rug. I'll make sure of that." Aliyah nodded against her mother's shoulder, grateful for the support. But even as Sarah held her, Aliyah couldn't shake the anger that still simmered inside her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the way people like Harper treated anyone they deemed suspicious, anyone who didn't fit their idea of who belonged in certain neighborhoods. "Mom," Aliyah said quietly, pulling back slightly. "Harper. He's done this before, hasn't he? To other people." Sarah's expression darkened, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, he has," she admitted, "and we're going to make sure he never does it again." Aliyah's fists clenched at her sides. "It's not just him, though. There are others, aren't there? Other officers like him." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. "Yes," she said softly, "there are." Aliyah looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with determination. "Then we have to stop them." Sarah smiled sadly, brushing a strand of hair from Aliyah's face. "We will," she promised. "But it's going to take time." Aliyah nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the injustice she had just experienced. She had always looked up to her mother, admired the work she did to bring justice to their community. But now, for the first time, Aliyah understood just how hard that fight really was. As they left the station together, the cool night air washing over them, Aliyah felt a newfound sense of purpose growing inside her. This wasn't just about one bad cop, this was about a system that allowed people like Harper to exist, to thrive. And Aliyah was ready to fight. The night air was cooler than usual as Sarah Taylor and Aaliyah walked to the car parked outside the station. Despite the resolution inside, the tension still hung heavy in the air. Aaliyah, normally talkative and energetic, was quiet, lost in her thoughts. She replayed the events in her head, the fear she felt when Officer Harper approached her, the humiliation of being handcuffed, and the disbelief when he dismissed her claim about her mother. That was the moment when it all shifted for her. She had seen police officers do their jobs before, and her mother had always made it clear that law enforcement was supposed to protect people. But now, she understood that there were others, like Harper, who didn't care about protection, only about control and power. Sarah watched her daughter closely as they reached the car. Aaliyah's silence was more telling than words. As they sat in the car, Sarah turned to face her. "You don't have to talk about it yet, if you don't want to," she said softly, trying to reassure her daughter. But Aaliyah, though young, was far from naive. The day's events had shaken something deep inside her, something that she couldn't easily put into words. "Mom, is this what it's like for everyone else?" Aaliyah's voice was steady, but the question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I mean, for people who don't have someone like you to protect them." Sarah paused, the weight of her daughter's question hitting her like a blow to the chest. She had always known that her role as a police officer, and more importantly, as a captain, gave her a level of privilege and protection that not everyone had. But hearing it from Aaliyah, seeing the reality of what happened to people who didn't have that kind of shield, struck her deeply. "Unfortunately, yes," Sarah said, her voice filled with regret. "Too many people don't have someone who can step in and make sure they're treated fairly. What Harper did today, that's something a lot of people experience. And it's wrong. It's something I've been trying to fight my entire career." Aaliyah looked out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass as streetlights passed by. "So what happens now? You're going to punish him, right? He's going to pay for what he did." Sarah exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. She wanted to give her daughter the comfort of an easy answer, but the truth was more complicated than that. There will be an investigation, and he's been suspended. But Aaliyah, these things, they take time. It's not always as simple as it should be. The system is slow, and there are people who will try to protect him, people who don't think what he did was wrong. Aaliyah's brow furrowed in confusion and frustration. "But you're in charge, Mom. You can do something." Sarah turned to her daughter, her heart breaking a little. "I'm doing everything I can, but I'm still part of a bigger system. And that system, it's not perfect." The car fell silent again as they drove through the city, past quiet neighborhoods where most of the houses were dark and still. Aaliyah's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. She had seen injustices before, stories on the news, protests that her mother had explained were about police brutality, but now it was personal. And now, it wasn't just something happening far away, it had happened to her. They pulled into their driveway, and the familiar comfort of home didn't bring Aaliyah the peace she expected. Instead, it only heightened her awareness of how different things could have been if her mother hadn't arrived when she did. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not just with Harper, but with the whole system. As they stepped into the house, the silence between them lingered. Sarah hung her jacket on the coat rack, trying to gather her thoughts. She had seen officers like Harper before, men who had spent years in the field and had slowly become jaded, consumed by their own prejudices. Harper's behavior didn't surprise her, but what terrified her was the thought of how close he had come to causing real harm to her daughter, and worse, how many others like Aaliyah he had harmed without her knowing. Sarah, the voice of James Taylor, Sarah's husband, echoed through the hallway. He came into view, his expression one of both concern and relief. "I heard what happened," he said, wrapping an arm around Aaliyah and pulling her into a hug. "Are you okay?" he asked her softly. Aaliyah nodded, but it was a hollow gesture. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired, I guess." James gave his wife a questioning look over Aaliyah's head. Sarah shook her head slightly. Now wasn't the time for a deep conversation. "Let's get her settled," Sarah whispered. "We'll talk later." After Aaliyah went to bed, Sarah and James sat together in the kitchen. The weight of the day pressed down on them both. James, always the calmer and more grounded of the two, reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "What happened?" he asked gently. Sarah shook her head, her voice strained. "Harper. He stopped Aaliyah while she was waiting outside the store. He handcuffed her, James. My daughter. He treated her like she was some kind of criminal." James' face darkened with anger, but he stayed silent, letting Sarah continue. "I arrived just in time. I made him release her, but... God, James, if I hadn't been there, what if he had taken her to the station and booked her? What if he had gotten rough with her?" Her voice cracked, and she closed her eyes, trying to push away the images in her mind. James squeezed her hand. "But you were there, Sarah. You stopped him." "That's not the point," Sarah snapped, her frustration boiling over. "The point is, this is happening all the time, to people who don't have someone to step in. Harper. He's one of many. There's a culture in this department that allows this to happen, and I'm part of that system. I'm supposed to be fighting it. But sometimes it feels like I'm just putting out one fire while a dozen more are burning." James leaned back, his eyes filled with understanding. He had seen Sarah struggle with this before, the battle between her loyalty to her position and her desire to reform the system from within. "So what are you going to do?" he asked softly. "Calm." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I'm going to make sure Harper never puts another kid in cuffs again. And I'm going to start cleaning house." James nodded. "You've been talking about this for a long time, Sarah. Maybe this is the push you needed." Sarah sighed, leaning her head in her hands. "I just didn't think the push would come at Aaliyah's expense." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked away the minutes, but Sarah felt like time had slowed to a crawl. She had been a captain for years, but now it felt like her role was more symbolic than ever. She could punish Harper, suspend him, and even have him removed from the force, but there would be another Harper, and another after that. The problem wasn't just one officer. It was the entire structure that allowed someone like him to thrive. Upstairs, Aaliyah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts swirled around what had happened, and for the first time, she found herself doubting the system her mother had always believed in. Could it really change? Could the department really be reformed? Or was the problem so deeply embedded that it was beyond fixing? The anger she had felt earlier returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just about Harper anymore. It was about the system that gave people like him the power to treat others the way he had treated her. And what scared her the most was that, without her mother's intervention, she could have easily become another statistic, another forgotten case of police misconduct. Her mind was racing, and sleep seemed impossible. She thought about her friends at school, the kids who had told her stories about being stopped by the police for no reason, about being treated like suspects simply because of where they lived or how they looked. She had always felt insulated from those experiences, protected by her mother's position. But now she realized that no one was truly safe, not even her. The next morning, Aaliyah was quiet at breakfast, but Sarah could see the fire in her daughter's eyes. She recognized that look. It was the same one she had when she first joined the police force, determined to make a difference, to fight for what was right. But now, Sarah knew how difficult that fight would be. As they prepared for the day ahead, Aaliyah finally broke her silence. "Mom, I want to help." Sarah looked at her daughter, surprised. "Help? With what?" "With stopping them," Aaliyah said, her voice firm. "With stopping people like Harper. I can't just let this go. I want to do something." Sarah smiled softly, pride swelling in her chest, but also a sense of sadness. She had hoped Aaliyah wouldn't have to face these battles so soon, but the world had forced her hand. "We'll find a way," Sarah promised. "But it's not going to be easy." "I know," Aaliyah said. "But I'm ready." Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing in her the same determination that had once driven her to join the force. But this time it was different. This time, it was personal. The days following Officer Rick Harper's suspension were tense for everyone involved. While Harper had been temporarily removed from duty, the ripples of his actions spread far beyond the station. The investigation into his conduct was just beginning, but for Captain Sarah Taylor, it wasn't enough. She knew that Harper's behavior was symptomatic of a much deeper problem, one that permeated the department from the ground up. What Harper had done to Aaliyah was not an isolated incident. Sarah knew this. She had heard the stories, seen the reports that were conveniently filed away, and spoken to officers who had witnessed similar abuses but remained silent out of fear or complicity. Sarah had always fought to change things from within the system, believing that reform was possible, but now the stakes were different. This time, the fight had reached her own family. This time it was personal. As the days passed, Sarah could feel the weight of her position pressing down on her more than ever before. She was expected to remain impartial, to allow the investigation to proceed without interference, but that was an impossibility. She was a captain, yes, but she was also a mother. The two roles had never collided so violently. It was late in the evening when Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the preliminary findings of the internal investigation. The paperwork was stacked high, and she sifted through the files with a focused intensity. Each report, each complaint filed against Harper, painted a clearer picture of a man who had abused his power for years and gotten away with it. Some of the complaints were buried under layers of red tape, marked as resolved without any real consequence. Sarah could see the pattern. Harper had a history of using excessive force, of profiling based on race, and of treating suspects with unnecessary aggression. Yet, somehow, he had managed to stay on the force. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the screen. It was Sergeant Mitchell, the same officer who had tried to defend Harper when Sarah had confronted him at the station. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mitchell," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "What is it?" "Captain, I think we need to talk." Mitchell's voice was low, almost cautious. "It's about Harper." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "What about him?" "I've been hearing things," Mitchell said. "Ever since the suspension, there's been talk." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Go on." Mitchell hesitated. "Look, you didn't hear this from me, but Harper has some connections. People in the department who've been covering for him for a long time. I don't know all the details, but I've heard whispers that some of those people aren't happy with the investigation. They're saying you're making things personal, that you're going too far." Sarah felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. "Too far," she repeated, incredulous. "This man handcuffed my daughter for no reason, Mitchell, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. How am I going too far?" "I get it, Captain. Believe me, I do," Mitchell said quickly, trying to placate her. But you know how it is. There are people who don't like their skeletons being dug up, and Harper's got a few. From what I'm hearing, some of those people might be trying to put a stop to the investigation before it goes any deeper. Sarah's heart sank. She knew the kind of resistance she was facing. It wasn't just about Harper anymore. If there were others involved, it meant that this investigation could unravel more than she initially anticipated. That the corruption might run deeper than she feared. "What exactly are you saying?" Mitchell Sarah asked, her voice steady but cold. "I'm saying that Harper isn't the only one you need to worry about," Mitchell replied. "He's been part of something bigger. Some of the guys they're talking about shutting this down. I've even heard that Harper's been in contact with certain elements outside the department. You know, the kind of people who don't take kindly to police turning on each other." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She had suspected that Harper was involved in something unsavory, but hearing it confirmed was unsettling. If he had connections outside the department, criminal connections, it could mean that this situation was more dangerous than she had realized. The thought of Harper aligning himself with criminals to protect his own skin made her stomach churn. "Do you have proof of this?" Sarah asked, her mind racing with the implications. "Not yet," Mitchell admitted. "But if you keep pushing this investigation, it could get ugly. I'm telling you this because I respect you, Captain. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but some of these guys, they don't play by the rules. They'll protect themselves at any cost." Sarah's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what that meant. The thin blue line was more than just an unspoken code of loyalty. It was a shield, one that officers like Harper and his associates used to protect themselves from accountability. And now, it seemed, that shield was being fortified to protect something much darker. "Thanks for the heads up," Mitchell Sarah said, her voice tight. "But I'm not backing down from this. If Harper's involved with criminals, then I'll make sure the investigation exposes it." Mitchell sighed on the other end of the line. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, all right? There are people who don't want this to come to light." Sarah hung up the phone and stared at the papers on her desk. The investigation was no longer just about holding Harper accountable. It was about uncovering a web of corruption that stretched far beyond one officer. And if what Mitchell said was true, then Harper's suspension was only the beginning. The real fight was just starting. Meanwhile, Harper's world was unraveling. He had spent years building his network of protection, cultivating relationships with people both inside and outside the department who benefited from his under-the-table deals. He had always been careful, making sure that his actions were never tied directly to him. But now, with the spotlight on him, those connections were starting to fray. People were distancing themselves, and he could feel the walls closing in. Harper sat in his small apartment, the blinds drawn to block out the world outside. The suspension had left him with too much time to think, and the more he thought, the angrier he became. In his mind, he was the victim, a good cop who had done what was necessary to keep the streets clean. Sarah Taylor was the one who had made this personal, using her influence to ruin him because of a misunderstanding. That's what he told himself, at least. But deep down, Harper knew the truth. He had crossed too many lines, made too many enemies. The investigation wouldn't just ruin his career, it could land him in prison. And prison, for a former cop, was a death sentence. He had seen it happen to others, officers who had been taken down by their own department and left to rot in a cell, at the mercy of the very criminals they had once put away. No, Harper wasn't going to let that happen. He still had some favors he could call in, and there were people who owed him. People who operated outside the law, the kind of people who could make problems disappear. But reaching out to them meant crossing a line that even Harper had hesitated to cross before. It meant fully aligning himself with the criminals he had once hunted. But what choice did he have? Harper picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His fingers hovered over a name: Lara, the leader of a local gang that had benefited from Harper's selective enforcement over the years. He had kept her operation running smoothly, and in return she had made sure that certain people stayed out of his way. It was a mutually beneficial relationship, but now Harper needed more than just a favor. He needed protection. He pressed the call button and waited. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. Lara's voice was low and smooth. "It's been a while. What can I do for you?" Harper swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "A favor, huh? I thought you were laying low after your little incident with Captain Taylor's kid." Harper winced at the reminder. "Yeah, well, things have gotten worse. The investigation's heating up, and I'm hearing rumors that they're going to try to pin a lot more on me than just the kid. I need help, Lara. I need protection." Lara laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "Protection? From who? The department, or from the other people you've pissed off?" Both, Harper admitted, the desperation in his voice creeping through. "I'm running out of options." Another pause. Then Lara's tone shifted, becoming colder. "You know, Harper, I've always appreciated the work you did for us. You kept things running smoothly, kept the heat off. But this is different. If I help you, I'm putting myself at risk. And I don't like risks." Harper's pulse quickened. "I can pay. I still have money. And I can keep helping you, even if I'm not on the force anymore. You know, I have connections. I can still make things happen." Lara was silent for a long time. Harper could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end, the tension building with every second that passed. Finally, she spoke. "All right, Harper, I'll help you. But this isn't a free ride. You owe me. Big time." Harper exhaled, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, Lara. I won't forget this." "I'll be in touch," Lara said curtly, and the line went dead. Harper stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. He had just made a deal with the devil, but it was the only way he could see to survive. He couldn't go down without a fight. But as the reality of his situation settled in, Harper realized just how deep he was sinking. Aligning himself with criminals meant that there was no turning back. If the investigation uncovered the truth, it wouldn't just be his career on the line, it would be his life. At that moment, Harper knew he had to act fast. He couldn't wait for Sarah Taylor or the department to close in on him. He had to strike first, and that meant finding a way to silence the investigation before it exposed him completely. Back at the station, Sarah was unaware of the dangerous alliances forming around Harper. She was focused on the investigation, determined to root out the corruption that had allowed officers like Harper to thrive for so long. But she was also aware of the growing tension within the department. Mitchell's warning had only confirmed what she already suspected, that there were people who didn't want this investigation to go any further. And if Harper was connected to criminal elements outside the force, that made the stakes even higher. As Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the latest reports, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Davis, her trusted second-in-command. Captain Davis said as he entered the room. "We've got a problem." Sarah looked up, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Harper Davis said grimly. "He's gone. We sent officers to his apartment to bring him in for questioning, but he's disappeared." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Looks like he skipped town, Davis explained. His apartment was empty, and no one's seen him for the last 24 hours. We've got a bolo out, but so far nothing. Sarah's mind raced. Harper had always been slippery, but this was different. If he had gone into hiding, it meant that he knew the walls were closing in, and if he was desperate enough to run, there was no telling what he might do next. "We need to find him," Sarah said, her voice steady but urgent. "If he's gone underground, we need to figure out where and who's helping him." Davis nodded. "I'll put the word out. But if he's connected to the wrong people, this could get dangerous." Sarah stood, her resolve hardening. "I know, but we can't let him get away with this." Captain Sarah Taylor paced in her office, the tension in her shoulders growing with every passing minute. Rick Harper had gone into hiding, and his connections with the local underworld were now becoming more than just whispers. The investigation, which had initially focused on his misconduct, had unraveled a web of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. But the clock was ticking. If Harper managed to fully disappear, all the evidence, all the work Sarah had put into this case, would mean nothing. Captain Lieutenant Davis called from the doorway, breaking Sarah's anxious pacing. "We've got a lead. Harper was spotted near the warehouse district late last night. We're checking with some of his known contacts in the area, but it looks like he's holed up somewhere nearby." Sarah's stomach tightened. The warehouse district, it was where Harper's shady dealings had long been rumored to take place. It was a known meeting ground for gang activity, especially the kind of operation Lara was running. If Harper had gone there, it meant he was desperate, and desperation made him dangerous. "Get the team ready," Sarah ordered. "We need to move fast before he slips away again." As the tactical unit geared up, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just taking down a dirty cop. Harper wasn't acting alone anymore. Whatever ties he had forged in the criminal world were now his lifeline. If they didn't get to him before his criminal allies did, there was no telling what might happen. The stakes had never been higher. The drive to the warehouse district was tense. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She thought of Aliyah, and how Harper had dared to lay his hands on her daughter. It wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about protecting her family and her community from men like him. Sarah's resolve hardened with each passing block. This was going to end tonight. The convoy of police vehicles arrived quietly at the edge of the industrial area. The warehouses were dark and silent, but the shadows felt alive, hiding threats that Sarah couldn't yet see. The officers spread out, moving carefully through the narrow alleyways, their weapons drawn, ready for anything. Sarah and Davis led the group, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached a large, dilapidated warehouse. "This is the one," Davis whispered, pointing to the faint glow of light seeping through a crack in the warehouse door. Sarah nodded, signaling the team to take their positions. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins. There was no turning back now. "On my count," she whispered to Davis, gripping her radio tightly. 3, 2, 1, go. The door to the warehouse burst open with a loud crash, and the tactical team flooded inside, their weapons raised. The dim light from a single hanging bulb illuminated the scene. A dozen men scattered around the room, startled by the sudden intrusion. Among them, in the center of the chaos, stood Harper, his face twisted in fear and anger. "Get down. Hands where we can see them," Davis barked, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Most of the men complied immediately, dropping to the ground as the officers moved in. But Harper stood frozen, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. He was cornered, and he knew it. Harper, Sarah called out, stepping forward. It's over. Don't make this worse. Harper turned to face her, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His desperation was palpable. This was never supposed to happen, he shouted, his voice cracking. I was just trying to survive. You don't know what it's like out there. Sarah's eyes narrowed. I know exactly what it's like. But you chose this, you crossed the line, and now you have to face the consequences. Harper took a step back, his hand reaching toward his waistband. Sarah's pulse quickened. Her hand instinctively went to her gun, but she hesitated. She didn't want it to end like this. Don't do it, she warned, her voice steady but firm. It's not worth it, Rick. Don't make us do something we'll all regret. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Harper's hand hovered over the weapon, his face contorted in indecision. The room was deathly silent, every officer watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Then, with a shaky breath, Harper dropped his hand, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I was trying to protect myself, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. I didn't want it to end like this. Sarah stepped forward, her gun still drawn but lowered. It doesn't have to end like this, she said quietly. But you need to come with us. Now. Harper's eyes flickered with a brief glimmer of understanding. He knew he was beaten. Slowly he raised his hands in surrender, the fight draining out of him completely. As the officers moved in to cuff him, Sarah allowed herself to exhale for the first time since they had entered the warehouse. It was over. Harper was finally in custody, and the web of corruption he had been part of was starting to unravel. But as Sarah watched him being led away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were others out there, others who had enabled Harper, protected him, and profited from his corruption. And now, with him behind bars, they would be coming to protect themselves. Davis approached, his expression one of relief mixed with caution. We got him, he said quietly. But what now? Sarah stared at the darkened corners of the warehouse, her mind already working on the next steps. Now we go after everyone else, she said firmly. This isn't just about Harper anymore. We need to clean house. As the officers began to clear the scene, Sarah took a moment to step outside, breathing in the cool night air. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Harper was only one part of the problem, but tonight she had taken the first real step toward making things right. The morning light streamed through the windows of the police station as Captain Sarah Taylor sat at her desk, staring at the mountains of paperwork in front of her. The aftermath of Rick Harper's arrest had set off a chain of events that she had both anticipated and dreaded. Now, with Harper in custody, the real work of dismantling the network of corruption within the department had begun. But it wasn't easy. Several officers had already been implicated based on Harper's confessions. His ties to criminals like Lara had led investigators down a dark path, revealing that Harper wasn't the only one who had abused his power. There were more officers who had been complicit, looking the other way while Harper's actions spiraled out of control. Some were involved in bribery schemes, others had participated in or covered up similar incidents of misconduct. It was a systemic problem, larger than even Sarah had realized. As Sarah flipped through the latest report, a knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Davis, his expression more serious than usual. Captain, you might want to take a look at this, he said, handing her a thin file. Sarah raised an eyebrow and opened the folder. Inside were photos, financial records, and transcripts of recent interrogations. All of it pointed to one disturbing truth: Harper had been more deeply embedded in the criminal underworld than anyone had suspected. His involvement with Lara's gang went far beyond just selective enforcement. Harper had been facilitating drug trafficking, laundering money through local businesses, and offering protection to certain key players in exchange for a cut of the profits. The web was vast, and it had spread far beyond what the department had initially uncovered. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was worse than she had imagined. The consequences of Harper's actions were far-reaching, and it was clear that he hadn't acted alone. How many more, she asked, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the situation. Davis sighed. We're still working on that, but it looks like a few more officers are going to be named in the next round of interrogations. We're getting cooperation from Harper, but it's slow. He's only giving us what he has to, trying to save his own skin. Sarah nodded. She expected as much. Harper wasn't the type to go down without dragging others with him, but he was also playing a careful game, revealing just enough to make deals, while withholding enough to maintain some leverage. And Lara, Sarah asked. Still in the wind, Davis said grimly. We've put out feelers, but no sign of her yet. She's smart. She'll stay underground for a while. Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the city below. The battle was far from over. The investigation into Harper's actions had exposed the rot in the department, but now she had to contend with the fallout officers who felt betrayed, others who were afraid they'd be next, and the public, who was slowly learning about the extent of the corruption. Sarah knew that trust in the department was hanging by a thread, and it would take years to rebuild it. Captain, there's something else, Davis said, his voice hesitant. Sarah turned to him, waiting. It's about the department's response to all this. There are officers, good officers, who are worried. They're afraid this whole thing is going to make the department look weak. Some are saying we should close ranks, handle it quietly. They're afraid of what's going to happen if this goes public. Sarah's expression hardened. I'm not sweeping this under the rug, Davis. Harper and the rest of them made this mess, and it's our job to clean it up, no matter how bad it looks. If we don't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the public to trust us? Davis nodded, though his expression remained troubled. I agree with you, Captain. But some people aren't going to like it. They're worried it'll tear the department apart. Sarah stood up, her gaze steady. Then let it. If that's what it takes to get rid of the rot, so be it. I'm not protecting anyone who doesn't deserve to wear that badge. Davis left her office, and Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the path ahead was going to be a long and difficult one. But she was prepared for it. She had to be, not just for herself, but for her daughter, for the community, and for every innocent person who had been wronged by the very people sworn to protect them. Later that evening, Sarah returned home, exhausted but resolute. She found Aaliyah sitting at the kitchen table, her textbooks spread out in front of her, but it was clear that her mind was elsewhere. Hey kiddo, Sarah said softly, sitting down beside her. Aaliyah looked up, her expression thoughtful. How's the investigation going? Sarah smiled wearily. It's a mess, but we're making progress. Aaliyah nodded, her eyes dropping to the table. Is Harper going to prison? Sarah sighed. That's up to the courts now, but with the evidence we have, it's pretty likely. There was a long pause before Aaliyah spoke again. Mom, do you think things will really change? I mean, with the police, will it actually get better? Sarah hesitated, knowing how much this question weighed on her daughter. Aaliyah had seen firsthand what the system's failures looked like, and Sarah knew that her answer mattered more than ever. I don't know, Aaliyah, she admitted honestly. I'd like to believe that we can make it better, But it's not going to happen overnight. There are still people out there who will resist change, people who benefit from things staying the way they are. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Aaliyah looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with a determination that mirrored Sarah's own. Then we have to keep fighting, she said quietly. For the people who don't have anyone to protect them. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she looked at her daughter. Aaliyah had been through so much in the past few days, but she had come out stronger, more aware of the world around her, and more determined to make a difference. Sarah knew that Aaliyah's future would be shaped by this experience, but she also knew that her daughter would not let it break her. We will keep fighting, Sarah promised, pulling Aaliyah into a hug, and we'll do it together. As they sat there, the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a moment. Sarah knew there were still battles ahead both inside the department and out, but with Aaliyah by her side, she felt stronger, more resolved to see it through. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be better, and she wasn't going to stop until it was. For now, that was enough.